So I think right now, yeah, we'll get started. And I just wanted to take a moment to welcome everyone here today. Welcome to the Michigan Student History Seminar Series, focused on hidden turning points in American history. My name is Ajay Purohit, and I'm a student at Green Hills School in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And this, as you might know, is a student-run initiative in which we came together, with a love of American history and a desire to bring it to the forefront of our conversation today. And as history enthusiasts, we wanted to use the benefit of hindsight to examine trends and instances in our nation's past, which we can often be overlooked. And in a particularly interesting time today, I think students around the state came together and uh, we believe that today is a time which will likely be viewed as a turning point, maybe not hidden at that, but it prompted a particularly deep interest among us students to re-examine other turning points in American history. And so we have a wide-ranging audience today, which we are quite grateful for, audience members from Michigan and beyond. And so today, to start off, Dr. Stamm is going to speak about some turning points in American history in his area of expertise. And then we'll have a discussion in a Q&A session between the audience and Dr. Stamm for the seminar. And during the Q&A, it would be great if you could all virtually raise your hand to ask a question. If you do, I know that can get complicated sometimes, but putting them in the chat should work fine as well. Also, a brief introduction of who you are would be great before your question. And before we get into it fully, I wanted to give a brief thank you to all of my fellow students across the state who helped make this happen. Thank you to everyone here, our audience. I want to extend a particular thank you to the seminar's leadership team: Bailey Roselle, Tui Bullock, Reza Harian, Anand Shahade, Monica Kovacs, Ashu Barat, and Quinn Song. Excellent help make it happen. Thank you. And with the introduction of the seminar and our goals for this event, I'll read an introduction for our speaker, Dr. Sam, who we are very, very fortunate to host today, and then we'll get started. So with that, Dr. Stamm, who is joining us today, is a professor and the chair of the history department at Michigan State University. He is a political and cultural historian with additional expertise on the history of media and journalism in North America. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago. He has published extensively on topics ranging from the relationship between politics and news to the intellectual history of media and communication, among many more. His books are greatly acclaimed, including Sound Business, Newspapers, Radio, and the Politics of New Media, and his most recent book, Dead Tree Media, Manufacturing the Newspaper in 20th Century North America, for which he was awarded the prize of Best Book Award from the Canadian Business History Association. In the past, Dr. Stamm has led the Michigan State University History Department in the American Historical Association's Career Diversity for Historians Initiative. He has also received the History Department's Richard E. Sullivan Endowed Award for Teaching Excellence. The winner of several other awards, Dr. Stamm's knowledge and work on American history has gained international recognition, and today we are incredibly honored to have the chance to speak with and learn from him. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Stamm with cameras, if you can. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ajay, for that great introduction. It's really nice of you and really kind of you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out after hours on a sunny Tuesday afternoon to talk about history. It's really nice to do this, and it's really nice to see all of you. And I'll look forward to the discussion. So Ajay asked me to talk about a couple of important turning points in the history of media and communications, that the subjects that I've spent a lot of time researching. So I picked three of them, and two of them I think are quite a long time ago, and one of them is just before most of you were probably born. And I tend to be, as you'll see from the first turning point I'm going to talk about, one thing that you always have to be careful about in histories of technology of any sort is avoiding recency bias. There's a tendency to think that the most recent turning point is the only and or most important turning point, and that's usually not the case, and it can sort of lead people to kind of misapprehend the nature of changes that happen. But I want to talk about the telegraph, the radio, and the iPhone. So two of these are very old. One of them, probably, most of you are probably born after 2007. I'm guessing if you're high school seniors, I would probably put many of you in 2008, 2009 in terms of when you were born. So this is, anyway, so um, I'll talk for a little bit and then I'll open it up for questions and look forward to hearing these from you. So the telegraph. Does anyone on this chat, does anyone know Morse code? No, okay, it's okay. It's okay. I actually don't either. The only thing I know is this is where SOS comes from. Dot dot dot. Was it dot 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 dash dash? See, I'd be screwed if there was an emergency. But this is SOS. Dot dot. So the telegraph was invented in the 1840s by a man named Samuel Morse. This is before the United States Civil War. So before Morse comes along and invents the telegraph, the way you're going to find the only way you're going to find out about something that happened in the world is someone's going to physically tell it to you through their voice, or you're going to read about it. So there's a lot of this. The newspapers are pretty widely circulated in early America and throughout the world. Um, but in many cases, if you look at these newspapers from the founding period, if you look at like the newspapers that Thomas Jefferson read, you're going to see a lot of instances where this is news that's a week, 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old. It's like a magazine more than a newspaper. The notion of what people thought of as a current event was not close to anything that we would think of as being current. So you had, in order to move information from one point to another, you had to physically move it. So if any, did any of you watch Game of Thrones in recent years? And they would have the raven that would fly. They would roll the little things up and they would give it to the raven, and that would speed off. So that your ability to communicate a message across space to somebody until the telegraph was limited by your ability to move something from point A to point B. And so, you could walk, you could ride a horse, you could put it on a boat, you could put it on a railroad, but you were still limited by that. So the telegraph changes all of that. And what the telegraph is a pretty simple system at the end. And it's basically wires with mechanisms at the end that distribute pulses along those wires. And these are the initially, like, if you can find this like a lot of times on the edge of town. Like the telegraph lines were laid, the railroads were the first the transportation network, and then they started putting the poles up next to the railroad line because they already had the right of way there. So that now those are mostly telephone wires, but in the mid 19th century, they were telegraph wires. And so you move these wires along there. And what you do is you have people who are trained in what's called Morse code. And if you're sitting there, you can Google it and you can see like a diagram for Morse code. It's like learning a separate language. So each letter of the alphabet is broken up into a series of dots and dashes. And a dot is a short pulse on the mechanism, and a dash is a long post. So it's like dee, 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 dee. I think that's SOS. I think that's correct if you're ever in a jam. Um, and so SOS, I mean, that's one of the more simple. Some of the other letters are like, dee, doo, dee, dee. So some of them can be, but anyway, you would have people who are trained in learning how to decipher these things, and there would be telegraph offices. And if you wanted to get something to a relative who lived far away, you would go to in Western Union was one of the big companies. You would go in there and you would hand them a piece of paper that had the written message that you would want to send, and they would walk to the back, and you would tell them which office you wanted it to go to, and they would make that connection based on where the wired network went, and they would tap this out letter by letter by letter. It's like it's a very early version of the thumbs and the text messaging. You're literally reducing communications to the movement of digits. It seems really old. It seems on the one hand very old fashioned. On the other hand, it's a revolutionary importance, because all of a sudden now, if you have a telegraph, rich people would have them, corporations would have them, investors would have them. If you have access to a telegraph, you have access to information that moves as fast as the speed of electricity, which is tens of thousands of times faster than anything that you could move physically. So they started laying cables in the United States. Morse invented this in the 1840s. They started laying cables in the latter part of the 1840s. And then by the 1870s, they had a transatlantic cable laid. And so think about this. In 1865, so the year, the end of the United States Civil War, it would take 2 weeks to get a message across the Atlantic. So if you were the United States government and you sent a diplomatic envoy to Europe, to France or to England to talk to leaders there, it would take 2 weeks to get a report from them before the telegraph, because they would have to write it out, put it on a ship. That ship would go across, and the ship would get to the port. Somebody have to take it from the port to the person who was going to read it. With a telegraph, it takes 7.5 minutes to get a 300 word message across the Atlantic in the late 1870s. So 1860s, 2 weeks, late 1870s, 7.5 minutes, which is a 2,500 times increase in the speed of information that you can move across the Atlantic Ocean. And I'll give you a comparison. Like there's in 1985, here's another dead technology that many of you probably never had the pleasure or displeasure to experience: the fax machine, which is just a was and is a god awful piece of technology. Used to be common in American offices. Apparently, they're still widely used in Japan. I'm not quite sure why, but so in 1985, you could send a 300 word message via fax in 10 seconds. And a fax machine a fax machine is basically a copy machine connected to a phone line. So you put the piece of paper in, you dial the number of the fax machine you wanted to send it to, the paper would feed in, it would make a copy, convert it to electrical impulses that would go out along the wire, and the other machine would spit the paper out. So 10 seconds to do that, 300 words in 1985. In 2015, 2 seconds to send a 500 word message via text once you've typed it. That's a 5 times increase in speed, which isn't that really that big of a deal from the fax machine, which is a really crappy, archaic technology. Again, but you go back to what happens in the 1870s, 2,500 times increase in the speed of information moving across the Atlantic Ocean. So this is really a revolutionary way for people to think about the world in which they live. It changes the way people think about what now is. Because all of a sudden now, somebody who's hundreds of miles away from you is only as far as the nearest telegraph office. They're not as far as the journey. Like, I mean, even think about something if you were going to go from Ann Arbor to Detroit right now, if you had to physically get a message between two cities that aren't that far from each other. If you had to go on foot, that's going to be a couple hours journey. If you're going to go on a bike, it might take you an hour, hour and a half, maybe. But with the telegraph, it's nearly instantaneous. And so this has all kinds of things that ripple through American society. One of them is it has some pretty significant effects on journalism. Have you ever heard the term wire service? Or you've ever heard of the Associated Press? This is what gives birth to those things. So what newspapers start doing is they just install uh, they just install telegraphs in their offices, and all day it's just a constant stream of news coming in on those wires from around the world. So you pick up a newspaper in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on a morning of the 1880s, and there's going to be stuff that happened in Europe that the day before. With the time change, it's a nearly instantaneous account of something that happened in London, something that happened in Asia. Distance really doesn't matter. I mean, the distance from Ann Arbor to Detroit to London to Seoul, South Korea, it's almost completely flattened out. By the invention of wired telegraphy. The delays are going to be at the receiving ends when you've got to print the things out and then set them in type. So it changes financial markets, because all of a sudden now everybody knows the price of goods everywhere. And this practice of arbitrage that people could use before the invention of telegraphy begins slowly to fade away. That is, everybody's knowledge of what market prices are is the same as long as they have access to a telegraph office. So you've got all kinds of changes in the way people understand current events. The way newspapers begin to use telegraphy, because it's such a pain in the butt to tap out every letter. It's just like when you all send text messages, you're going to be more efficient with the things that you do, because it's simply more efficient to do that. In many cases with text messages, we reduce things to like WTF or even emojis, simply because the person on the other end is going to understand what you're saying, and it's less work to type WTF than it is to type or, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean. That's surprising. You know, telegraphy does that century, like, this it starts doing that in the 1870s. And so the sentences, the news that's coming across the wires is being transmitted across the wires by people who have the same reasons you do for typing WTF. They want to be efficient about these things. So the things people start reading get shorter and crisper. And you can trace this, for example, between, like, think about the difference if you read like a Charles Dickens novel. That's a pre-telegraph novel. Long ass sentences, lots of clauses. Then think about Ernest Hemingway. I mean, Chris Hemingway was a journalist, and he was somebody who grew up in the telegraphy era. So it at a really big picture level, it changes people's perspectives on what now is, and it changes people's perspectives on language. Language starts to become crisper, more efficient. And in many respects more direct. So a lot of these things, that people attribute to the internet era, the death of distance, or this belief that there's, this constant now. These things are really things that go back to the period in the United States before the Civil War, and around the world just after our Civil War. So, this begins in the 1840s. So the telegraph is, I think, a really underappreciated. It's really underappreciated, I think, how revolutionary the telegraph was in changing people's relationship to the outside world. It changes people's imagination of the size and reach of the size of the world they live in, and their connection to people who live around in that world. So that's the first one, the telegraph. I think the second one of these things, these kind of revolutionary moments that people underemphasize, is the invention of radio broadcasting in the 1920s. I think when people think about the revolution in broadcasting in the 20th century, they usually go straight to they usually think of television. And when you learn a lot about radio, what you kind of realize is that television's really just a radio with pictures. And it's not unimportant to have the pictures. There's a lot of things that are really important, especially for thinking about news and journalism. People seeing, for example, what happened in the civil rights movement on television is of incredible importance. I'm not minimizing any of that. But a lot of the things that we talk about with television, that is this idea that you can be a couch potato, or this idea that you can have a vicarious experience of the world from your living room. All of these things are hallmarks not of the Cold War era, but of the period right after World War One, when radios developed. So the real short version is, so when people were, for a lot of people, telegraphy was great. But then there were a lot of innovators that started thinking, well, this would be even better if we could just get rid of those damn wires, right? It's like the difference between, if you have a phone with a cord that you've got to drag into the next room. You guys are probably too young for this one, versus a cordless phone. So people started, the experimenters, inventors, they started trying to figure out if they could do telegraphy without wires. And by the early part of the 20th century, they had figured out ways to do this. This was also something that was really important for putting on ships that were crossing the Atlantic. That one of the the Titanic had a telegraph, and one of the reasons why there was a thing that telegraphy was widely used on ships by that time. And there was this belief among some, and there was a big push for regulation of communications in the United States, because some people believed that all of the chatter happening on the eastern seaboard between amateur telegraph users prevented the Titanic's SOS codes from properly reaching the shore. Anyway, so that was the next step. Telegraphy is point to point communication with wires. The next step in that evolution is wireless telegraphy. So point to point communication without wires. And then radio is point to mass. So I have a transmitter, you have a receiver. Your receiver can't talk back to me, right? Like if I have the transmitter, you're listening. That's what's different between the broadcast model and telegraphy. But that then becomes the next thing. And this is hugely important in the 1920s, because it domesticates information. It brings all of this popular entertainment to people. So I had a few, just real quick. I was going to go through the kind of really important kind of major things that radio does. And again, this is 1920s. So it brings things that you used to have to get off your butt and leave the house to do into the home. So symphonies, lectures, religious services, All of these things that you used to have to physically go and do. You'd have to go to a church, or you'd have to go to a symphony hall, or you'd have to go to a lecture hall, or you'd have to go to a baseball game. One of the first things that started going on the air early in the 1920s was baseball games. Most people couldn't go to a baseball game if they had an actual job, because before lights went in stadiums, they were all day games. If you had a day job, you would never have seen a Tigers game in person except on the weekends. With the radio, you just turn it on when you're at work, and all of a sudden, there you go. It's just like, the radio. So it brings all of these things that you used to have to leave the house to go and do in into the home. One of the things it does is it does create some anxiety for people, because it starts a kind of thinking that continues down to the present day, where people do get anxious about their ability to demarcate the outside world from the home. And it can sometimes feel like media is invading the home and there's no escape from it. And I think we all have that feeling of profound happiness and peace when we go on a vacation to a place where we're out of cell phone reception. And at first, it's a little bit disconcerting because we can't keep track of anybody. And then after about an hour, it's like, I should do this all the time. This is great. But so so radio does that first. The second thing that it does is it rapidly accelerates the speed at which news and information could be disseminated to the public, and it transforms the role of the newspaper in doing that. You ever seen like an old movie, or like where you have a newsboy hawking, going extra, extra, read all about it? Before, like what an extra was literally an extra edition of the newspaper. So they print the newspaper in the morning. If something really important happened during the day, they wouldn't post like an update there. This is 100 years before, 80 years before they would post updates on websites. They would actually reprint, they would redo the front page of the newspaper, print a whole separate edition, and then sell you that extra edition so that you would get that. And they would often do this with baseball scores in the afternoon. There was a tradition of buying an afternoon newspaper simply to find out what the score of the game was, because you'd have no other way of doing that. Radio changes all that. All of a sudden now you can listen to events live. So there's no need to buy a Detroit News in the evening to find out who won the Tigers game, because you listened to the Tigers game. Or you heard there would be these periodic news broadcasts where, when you hear events, I don't know how many of you are regular radio listeners now, but you'll hear people will do like, they'll be like, if you're driving with your parents, your grandparents, you'll hear things like, news and traffic on the nines or something like that. And they'll give these little blurbs about like, President Trump said this today, and the stock market's up 50 points, and there's a traffic jam on I-96 in Novi or something like that. This stuff all radio kicks all of this stuff off. And so, it accelerates things even more than what telegraphy had done, because telegraphy is connecting things at the speed of electricity. But the choke point is still the person at each end, the person at the end who has to turn that into printed stuff, set the news in type, and then get you the newspaper. With radio, you just turn your set on, and it's all just coming in the form of sound. So really important there. A third thing that it did is it removes literacy as a barrier to information, which is no small thing in a nation of immigrants. When radio was developed in the 1920s, the United States was in the middle of a huge immigration wave. At that time, most of these immigrants were Southern and Eastern European. So this is, if any of you are Italian, Polish, Russian, if you're Catholic, but if you're Catholic other than Irish, if you're Jew, if your family's Jewish, this is statistically, this is quite likely when that relative came to the United States, somewhere between the 1880s and 1924, when the U.S. enacted really strict immigration restrictions. But many of you come from families, I'm sure, who you might be immigrants, or you have a recollection of an immigrant family member coming to the United States. Well, one of the easiest ways to learn the language is simply to put the TV on. It's no pressure. It's a way of getting acculturated to the language. It's a way of not feeling, it's a terrible thing to be an adult who can't speak a language. It feels you're reduced to feeling like a child. And if you have done foreign travel to a country where you don't speak the language, you know that feeling of helplessness when you're just trying to buy a pack of gum and you can't do it. Radio changes this. For a nation of immigrants, it means that they can just turn the set on and just listen. So it doesn't mean that I don't want to say that it teaches everybody English. It's not as important as like the public school system in that regard. But it is a really important thing in a nation that is having strong waves of immigration from countries that don't speak English to allow people to get themselves acculturated to life in America. So the last two of these, it 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 breaks down geographic boundaries in a way that helps to create a kind of new American consciousness. Radio, again, it explodes distance in a very live way through the form of sound. And this is a part that's a little bit technical, but it's kind of fun if you ever get a chance to experience this. At that time, all radio was on AM. The FM band. The radio may be so old you guys might not even know what I'm talking about with AM versus FM. FM is the one that sounds better. You guys might be serious. Serious is satellite, right? AM is amplitude modulation. FM is frequency modulation. FM sounds better. It was invented in the 1940s, but the waves don't go nearly as far. Whereas the way the AM signal goes, and this is really important in the Midwest, is that it hugs the line of the Earth, and when the sun goes down, it bounces off the ionosphere and comes back down. So what that means is you can hear signals from hundreds of miles away at night. So if you're in the middle of Michigan and it's 1929, Christmas 1929, the stock market crash has just happened, the depression's happening. When the sun goes down, you turn on your AM radio and you pick up Chicago easy. You could pick up Memphis, Tennessee easy. I mean, these are places that are like a good. I mean, now that's Memphis is a good day's drive from where we are. So it's a big deal to just like you just flick a dial on something that doesn't have a subscription fee, and all of a sudden you're listening to the sounds of Memphis. Um, it's really kind of wild. So if you ever have the experience, if you're ever driving around at night and you still have a car that has an AM radio, it's really fun to do at sunset. It's just flip around the band, just click through and listen to what you get, and then do it again after it gets dark. And it's crazy what you can pick up. I mean, you'll pick stuff up from hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And it really works in the middle part of the United States where everything's flat. The game changes when it hits mountains. But as long as you're in an area that's flat, these things will go. So the Detroit News had a station that you could hear in Cuba on clear nights. So there would be people in Cuba who would like tune in on their radio set and listen to the sounds of stuff in Detroit. Changed the way people listen to music because you could hear, Southern rock, Southern music, race music, as it was called then, coming out of stations in the South. You could hear all kinds of stuff. Um, and you could have this live experience of listening to somebody who was in another place, which was kind of wild for people in an era before commercial air travel, in an era when most people didn't have a family automobile. People's geographic lives were generally pretty constrained. So the final thing here is that radio did is it reconfigured the relationship between ordinary people and the people who governed them. So for people before radio, you would live and vote for president, maybe serve in the military, but you would certainly die, in all likelihood, never hearing the voice of the president who ran the country that you lived in. Because there was some practices of recording. Some phonograph recordings were done in the earlier part of the 20th century, and they're really boring to listen to, and I don't think many people actually did that. But you would, unless you attended a political rally or went to, or and that the president or the candidate was going to, you would never, all you would ever do is read about these people and you would see pictures of them. You have no idea what their voice sounds like. It's really kind of, if any, for the one who's kind of wild is Theodore Roosevelt, who has this kind of very macho persona in American history. And you listen to his voice and he kind of sounds like this. He's going to talk about the American people. And it's really kind of wild when you listen and you hear the voice does not at all match the sense you have of the sense I always had of the man from reading about him and his sort of machismo and all that. And this, so it's really, so this is the person who really mastered this was Franklin Roosevelt. This is that you may have heard of the idea of the fireside chats. So radio's invented in the 1920s. It becomes a mature medium by the end of the decade. So they in the 1924 election, both parties broadcast the convention proceedings live over the radio. Um, National Broadcasting Company, or NBC, starts in 1926. That they're still around. Peacock might be the way you interact with the National Broadcasting Company now. They own that app. The Columbia Phonograph, the Columbia Broadcasting System, or CBS, starts in 1927, and I believe that's now Paramount, but I could be wrong about these things change owner. By the end of the 1920s, it's a mature medium. Then Franklin Roosevelt gets elected in 1932. The Depression's happening, and it turns out that Roosevelt is really, really good as a radio speaker. He's got this soothing voice. He talked very slowly. He's got a very paternalistic, patrician sound, and his ability to talk to people in their homes about what's going on. It gives him this personal connection with people at a time of tremendous stress in American life. Depression starts in 1929 and does not end until after World War II. World War II starts in 1941, ends in 1945. Roosevelt is the only president. They made the amendment that limited you to 2 terms in office after Roosevelt died, but he was elected president 4 times. You know, the American people liked what he was doing. You can't attribute this all to radio. But in many cases, the reason that people had these kind of positive perceptions of him was because they developed this deep, intimate, personal connection with him by listening to him on the radio. They felt like they knew him. And there's a fascinating thing. You can draw a relatively straight line from that to contemporary politicians using Twitter or TikTok or some other social media. Like Roosevelt starts a thing that for national politicians, in many cases, you're only as successful as your ability to work in the dominant mass medium of the day. So John F. Kennedy, he's a television president. Good looking guy, great head of hair. He's on television. Bill Clinton was a master of being on television. Donald Trump is a master of social media. So whatever you think about Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan was terrific on television. So whatever you think about any of these people's politics or policies, the reality is each one of them was a master of the most important mass medium of the day that they were president, and that goes a long way to explaining their popularity. This is not, again, the moral of this story, of this part of the story, not new to social media. This stuff starts over 100 years ago with the development of radio. So the last thing I'll say real quick, because I want to make sure we have time for you guys to ask questions, is I think the third of these things that is of long-term historical revolutionary importance is the iPhone. Which some of you may be. I don't mean, I'm not a partisan about this. This is not like, it's not like androids don't matter or something like that. I'm not trying to be a partisan about that. But the smartphone is incredible. The smartphone does a number of things that are just incredibly important and transformative. So some of the things that it does, and some of the things that Steve Jobs is a lot like Henry Ford, that he gets a little bit more credit than he deserves for certain things. Like Henry Ford didn't invent cars. Henry Ford invented a way to make a car that was more efficient than anybody else was doing at the time. And that allowed him to make the Model T. People had been developing, mobile phones existed, what we now call dumb phones existed before iPhones. And I know I read interesting stories about young people who are switching to dumb phones because all they really want to do is like talk to their friends and text. They don't want to be surveilled all the time, and they don't want to feel like information is bombarding them, but they also don't want to be disconnected. So they go to, like, these old flip phones. Those have been around for, and you see in movies about the 80s, movies and TV shows about the 80s and the 90s, these big brick-sized mobile phones with these giant antennas that were coming out. So mobile phones had existed. So Steve Jobs didn't invent that. Apple had also in previous years made a lot of money with the iPod, which was a portable music player. And then there were other companies like Blackberries that had been around already doing mobile communications. You may remember one of your parents having one of these, and it's very archaic. It had a little tiny screen and then a full size physical keyboard. They're really kind of wonky to look at. So what the iPhone did in its initial iteration was to bring these three things together: internet communicator, uh, mobile phone, and music player. The original iPhone had no app store. It was a closed system. You had, I think it had 16 apps on it, maybe, and that was it. And it was great. You could use it for phone calls, you could text, you could browse the web, you could listen to your music. Um, what happens after that, though, is it enables that device, the ability of that device to allow you to be individually able to access all of these different media. So films, radio sound, video, text sound, you could read the newspaper there. It takes all of these things that used to be different media, puts them onto one device. So the radio collected all these experiences that you used to have to leave the house to do, puts them in your living room. The iPhone takes all of these things that used to involve different devices and puts them in the palm of your hand. And then one of the most important things that's developed with that then is what we now call social media. Because one of the revolutionary things that iPhones do is, and other forms of smartphones, is they not only allow us to talk to each other, but they allow us to broadcast ourselves. This used to be the this when YouTube first went online, that was the company slogan, broadcast yourself. So it used to be, in the radio era, you used to have a lot of money to own a building, own a radio station, have the transmitter, get the license. With social, with the internet, everybody's broadcasting themselves, and with mobile technologies, you're doing it from wherever you want to go. And it's the downside of that. So you get a very individualized media stream because it allows us in the palm of our hands to set the parameters for any information that's coming into us. It allows us to participate because we can share these things with other people. We can also then become people who have a public voice by using a social media platform, Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, or like you are, in a sense, you can be a media property. And then whether the social media influencer is the end of Western civilization, I don't know. Sometimes I think that it is, but this is something that enables those sorts of things. These are people who get audiences in the millions, the tens of millions. All of this is unprecedented. So, um, what I'll leave you with, though, is that the downside of all of this is the giving up of privacy, because the bargain you make when you with analog, like the newspaper didn't surveil you. The newspaper didn't know how long you spent reading the news section before you went to the sports section. The newspaper couldn't judge you because you just played the games and you didn't actually read. You went to Wordle. You didn't read the article about the ongoing war in the Middle East. Um, when you listen to the radio, they weren't, when they did ratings for television, they would get it because people would fill out these forms telling the companies, this is like what these called Nielsen ratings. People would tell marketing companies what they watched or what they listened to, and that's how they knew, because they didn't know. There was no way they could check what you were listening to on your radio set. You could tell people, hey, I listen to classical music all day, when the reality is you're just listening to rock and roll or jazz or something. But what these devices do, what these things do, they make a lot of things really convenient, but the trade-off is everything's tracked, everything's recorded, everything's tracked, and there's all sorts of troubling consequences with that, politically, socially. Um, but it's a very different world to be walking around with this kind of communicator in your hand. So just there's the notion of being connected to a wider world. Let's finish with this. Again, I hope you get it. It traces back well over, we're talking 100 and almost 180 years now to the invention of the telegraph. So feeling yourself part of a wider world, nothing new about that. Experiencing the wider world through electronic media is now over 100 years old through the radio. Again, nothing new about that. But the ability to have it all, to talk back, and to have everything you do tracked, that's something that's new, and that's something that really does separate your generation. You are a gen like I'm 53, so I remember not having a smartphone. Then I remember getting a smartphone, and then I remember the difference between a smartphone and an iPhone. You all, I don't know, you all grew up where your first phone was probably a smartphone. And so this world of individualized media and surveillance is something that's been a part of your life for all of your lives. And there's a lot of things about that that make your generation very different from the one that I grew up in. And I think that's what's so revolutionary about the iPhone. So I'll stop there. I hope that was interesting and useful.
Definitely. Thank you. I mean, this is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Super cool to learn about. It's hard to imagine uh, modern life or what the world would look like without these three things. And
Yeah.
so that's amazing. So thank you for
Yep.
that, Dr. Stam. And I think we can open it up to questions. And briefly, I wanted to, as we take questions from everyone, open it up and start off with something that uh, a lot of us were wondering about, which
Mhm.
was related to kind of ownership of
Yep.
media. And I know that in your book, Sound Business, you speak on an often ignored aspect of US media history, which is the role of newspaper owners and the role newspapers
Mhm.
played in communications. And we were wondering more about that. And so could you explain kind of the importance and maybe the hidden role that these people who own the newspapers had in communication history?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. They, in many cases, had a. I mean, there were some who were hands off. Most of them were not. So, I don't know if any of you have followed the recent controversy about Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post's endorsement in the last election. That that it's to me when I as a historian I was like, well, welcome to the 19th century, because that was the common thing for newspapers. So newspapers were um in the 19th century they were aggressively, and in the 18th century in United States history, aggressively partisan. And if you go back and look at a lot of the names of newspapers in the 19th century, where it would be like the Springfield Republican or the Ann Arbor Democrat, like it would actually have the name of the party in the newspaper. And then in the later part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, they started changing it into things like Chronicle, Herald, Sun, Tribune, these things that are more about like hailing and producing information. But even then, even when they moved the names away, most people who read newspapers actively clearly knew what the politics of the owner was, and they believed that that owner's politics shaped the news, shaped the content and the structure of the news that they were getting in the paper. So, if you were if you were a Democrat in a certain, like if in Chicago, Illinois, a city where I lived for many years, and I've spent a lot of time studying that media. I mean, the Chicago Tribune was a very strongly right-wing newspaper. And the owner was, to the point that you ever been to Michigan Avenue and seen the Tribune Tower? It's kind of right by the river with a sort of Gothic top. It's a beautiful building that they've turned into condos. But the guy who built that building um, was an aggressive supporter of Republicans, to the point that he used to give free office space. He gave free office space to the Republican candidate for president in 1936 in the Tribune building. So the notion that the newspapers were objective or nonpartisan is a very recent 20th century invention. Um, and everybody kind of knew what the politics of the newspapers were. And so when you see things now, in a lot of ways, the rise of Fox News started in 1996. So it seems like for you guys, it's been around forever because you've never known a world that didn't have it. But that the era of sort of journalistic objectivity and the idea that newspapers and television news were supposed to be nonpartisan, that really started changing after 1996. And whatever you think of Fox's politics, the brilliant business move on the part of Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes to realize that they had people who wanted news presented to them differently, and that was a model that they got from the 19th century newspaper market, where you would sell newspapers based on what your politics were.
Thank you, Dr.
And
Stam.
everybody, one other thing, and the other thing is everybody knew who the newspaper owner was in your town. Like I have no idea who. Newspapers are now all owned by chains where the main office is, it's owned by the Gannett chain or whatever, whoever the heck it might be. Who knows where the owner's going to be? But these newspaper owners were like deeply embedded in communities, and everybody kind of knew who they were. Um, and they were kind of pillars of civic activity. And that's another thing that's really changed about this in recent years.
That's super interesting. Thank you, Dr. Stam. And yeah, so I guess if anyone has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand
Yeah,
and see Inan has a question.
yeah.
Yeah, hi, my name is Inan Chahade. I'm a member of the leadership team.
Nice to
First of
meet
all,
you.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for your time and all the work that you've done. I I was wondering how you've seen politics and commercialism progressively invade content and journalism, and how those effects have changed the perception of journalism as a whole.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's such a big business now, and it's driven by. I mean, you often hear the term in driven by eyeballs or page views. Like journalism is out, and it's become really aggressive in recent years because I think it can be tracked so much. I mean, this is because everything we read online, they know how long we spend reading the story. They know if we click through to anything else. So it's hyper commercialized in that way. On the other hand, this is also one of those areas that has some really interesting antecedents, going back 100 years ago, like to the newspaper. You go back and look at these newspapers back in the glory days. So like back when, like, Joseph Pulitzer was publishing the New York World, or, William Scripps was publishing the Detroit News, like these legendary newspapers. If you actually go and look at the actual newspaper, what you realize is that somewhere between 40 and 60% of that newspaper are ads. It's not like it was all news or all, serialized Dickens novels or Dostoevsky novels or something like that. It's like it's ads for the grocery store or pants or, liquor or something like that. So one of the things that's really common there is that, for centuries, for decades, and centuries in the case of newspapers, they've been commercial entities. Now they're commercial entities of a particular sort, and this is where I think things have kind of, in my opinion, gone wonky in recent years. Is they've always been public spirited institutions, publicly interested institutions, and they used to be thought of like in the same way that churches and public schools would be thought of. These were civic institutions. The news and they had a commercial element, but there was always thought to be a strong separation between advertising and editorial, as they would call it. And I think what's happened in recent years is that I don't mean to editorialize myself here, but I do think that regardless of the medium, the people who own institutions of the mass media put profit ahead of public service too often. They're chasing eyeballs, they're chasing engagement. You hear terms like clickbait, and you see this even in good news. I mean, you see this in terrible news sources all the time. Like, I mean, you all are really savvy about this stuff. I mean, you're just like, I'm not clicking on that. Like, it's just obvious clickbait. Or if you're scrolling through Instagram and every second thing is some ad for, it's like, I'm not going to click through that. But you can look at respected news websites, the Washington Post or the New York Times, and you can really see this in action. Like, there's advertisements above the banner of the newspaper. There's advertisements in the middle. You can be reading an article about something very serious going on in the Middle East, and there's an ad in the middle of the page for Cartier diamonds or something like that. So I think what's happened, to answer your great question, briefly, is that I think the having to make money has always been a part of the news business. Somebody had to pay the reporters, somebody had to buy the rolls of paper to print the newspapers on, someone had to pay the staff to go and sell those newspapers. They're always commercial enterprises. But I think the balance between commercialism and public service has tilted too far towards the commercialism. Many of these companies now are publicly traded corporations where it's all about shareholder value. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people prefer public media like NPR or community newspapers or things like that, because there is a belief with those that these literally are public, that they're not beholden to the pressure of advertisers, and that they're not aiming to just sell you crap in the middle of the news. So thanks for that great question.
I think we have a hand raised from Tag Dershmer.
Yeah.
Sorry if I missed this early. My Wi-Fi has been spotty. But with the rise of social media and anyone being able to kind of newscast and report on current events, how do you see the role of official news reporting and news information changing in the future?
Mhm. It's been fascinating to watch this. I mean, newspapers have become a lot like magazines used to be. So newspapers used to be, they would be the things that they would be the first source, the first place you got for you buy a paper a couple in the morning and the afternoon. That would be the first time you learned about something. Radio interrupts that by giving you live news throughout the day. Social media has just accelerated that to the point, and this is probably one of the reasons why a lot of young people have turned away from newspapers is they have this experience of picking one up and reading it and going, there's nothing in here I didn't already know. Like if it doesn't bore me, I heard this on social media 3 hours ago. Why would I read it? So the thing that I think good newspapers are doing is recognizing that and realizing that what their aim should be is not to give people the first report of news, but to provide people with context for understanding that news better. So, giving background information, connecting what's going on. Um, in many you can do good journalism simply by following social media. In many cases, people who do reporting on conflict zones, there's no journalists on the ground, and so what people are doing is learning to sift intelligently through social media on the ground to then write stories. So I think what these respected news organizations in a lot of ways have become are filters. That is, they're picking out all this information that they're getting from throughout the world, putting it in, narrativizing it, making it engaging, but then also hopefully, and when it's done well, providing context so that we can better understand what's going on. I mean, I think that's the difference. In a lot of ways, that might be one of the most important differences between good journalism and bad journalism, is the bad stuff simply wants to get you to look at it. So they want if there's a video of a bomb that goes off somewhere or something like that, people are just tuned into the carnage, or they're just tuned into that video that's going to be arresting for 15 minutes before they swipe on to the next thing. The good journalism is going to put that in context, and it's going to explain to you why this is important, offer you some explanations about why this is happening, what it means that this is happening, and make you think about it. I mean, a good journalist, I think, a good journalist is in a lot of ways like a good teacher. They help interested people learn more and better understand the world in which they live. So, um, I hope that answers your question about that.
Ashu, I see a hand there.
Oh, okay. Hi.
Hi,
I'm Ashu, and
nice to
I
meet
was
you.
nice to meet you. Yeah, and I had a quick question because you were talking about earlier how telegraphing shortened and made like language itself more efficient
Mhm.
and to the point. And I was just curious about how you think the more efficient way in which we communicate today affects literature and journalism.
Yeah, so I tend so there's some people my age and older think it's really bad. Those kids these days, they just talk in emojis, or I don't look at it. I think I mean, so I don't use social media. But I see examples of it when I read like the newspaper. I read the newspaper online. I don't and I think there's a tremendous amount of creativity that you see in the language that people use on social media. I think it can be really funny. I think the ability to hyperlink things has allowed for a kind of communication and narrative and storytelling, which is really unprecedented because you couldn't do that before internet communication. Like if even on the radio, they would say, today there was a story in the New York Times, but you didn't have that story in front of you. If you go on and you have a tweet about a story, you can embed a link to that story and in a certain sense bring that into a narrative that you're telling. But I think there's a lot of creativity to it. um, I also think that one of the things that people who are critical of young people and of people who use, I think people think that because people use social media in a certain way to speak a certain way, they assume that that's the only way that they talk and they think. It's like, no, it's just like learning to speak a dialect of a language. And I think just like with humor, like people are, if you understand like humor is a function of understanding a culture. And I think people who do well on social media often are people who do very well with traditional English or whatever their traditional language might be. It doesn't mean that that's the only way that so I think people underestimate the degree to which social media English is a dialect of English. And even though I'm not on it, I really appreciate that people do it. I think the slang is I also think I think all generations, it's a really creative way for people to create a language of community, and all communities do this. Like there's regional slang, for example, that like where I'm from. I don't, no one here says, I'm from Northern California, and everybody says hella there. Like they were, it's like it means like a lot of things. Oh, there were hella people there. No one says that outside. And then there's a certain really small part of Northern California where they say hell of, and it's a very specific kind of regional thing. And you find this all over the country. And to me, social media is like that. It allows people to create a kind of shared language. And it's sort of generational. There's a lot of like, there was a student that we had working in our office who would always tell me funny new forms of like social media English that so she would keep me up to date on certain things like I didn't know anything about Riz, which I don't know if that Riz may have had its day already, like that may already be passe. But whenever someone told me about this a few years ago, that was like the big. So then I finally understood, like, oh yeah, I saw a guy in a shirt that said he is risen, and I didn't understand what it meant. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, that's actually pretty funny. Like, so yeah, I think it's just an evolution of the way that people talk to each other, and I think that there's a tremendous amount of creativity in there by a lot of people. Now, it does have, I mean, it I will say this with one caveat, and this may not apply to folks like you who are around at 6 o'clock talking about history on the internet with a professor, but there is a danger that people don't develop attention spans to read difficult things or involved things because they get so used to reading things that are short and pithy and engaging. And I think that there is something to that. I don't think it's as big of a problem as detractors think it is. But I have a BA in English and a PhD in history, and I feel it sometimes. Like I sit down I force myself to read novels that require me to engage with the text. And I occasionally will force myself to read poetry. I mean, I like poetry. I wouldn't say I love it, but I do it specifically because it's kind of like working out, because it really makes you, and I realize like how much my brain is used to skimming and how much I'm used to kind of going over and how much I need images to enhance the message I'm getting. So I think it is something to be mindful of. Like I think that there's been a tremendous amount of creativity unleashed, and that's utilized by especially young people using these things. But it does have to be something that people take care with, because it's just like eating junk food or not working out. If you do it too much, when you try to go back and do it, you're going to realize those muscles have all kind of shriveled a little bit, and it can be a bit difficult. So um, I think that's the other side of that one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sa. I think the term Riz still is in use
Okay.
today. So definitely applicable still. And
Okay.
a hand from Etienne.
Yep.
Hi. I just wanted to go back to like the implementation of like the telegraph and the radio. And I was wondering, like, to what extent did political efficacy and like voter turnout change as like voters were exposed to like, their politicians much more and much more vividly?
Yeah, great question. It they went up a little bit, but I don't think it was specifically because of those media. There was always a hope that that would happen. I think there were a couple moments. So people in the 19th century political culture tended to be much more public than the political culture that happened. Their political rallies were a much bigger thing, going to political speeches. People were a lot more strongly identified with particular political parties in the latter part of the 19th century. And telegraphy didn't really change that in a lot of ways. If anything, it might say that it created a sort of confirmation bias that continues down to the present day, where what it allowed people to do was to get greater and quicker access to information that they already agreed with. Um, I think there is some of the early elections in the radio era had tremendously high turnout, and you can it's the elections of 1932 and 1936 when Franklin Roosevelt was elected were really high. Um, but after that, that you tend to see electoral participation by Americans going down. And it's interesting because there were these same utopian hopes about television that, oh, this is going to engage people with politics and they're going to feel more a part of it. And then they're going to go out and vote. And it turns out that that maybe isn't what's happening, that it's maybe turning people off or they're feeling disengaged from it, that the kinds of things that they're doing in the House as spectators are substituting for forms of political engagement that they would have had in the 19th century, like going out to a political meeting or something like that. So, there's another way of thinking about it that I'm not sure I fully subscribe to this view, but it is something worth thinking about that being a domestic audience for political content, on the radio and on television, um, has a way of disengaging people because it's all part of a broader sense of everything I need is on the couch. Um, so it's something that I think a lot the political scientists are still kind of working out because there was a lot of belief that social media would do this for young people, that this was going to be this great mobilizing tool, that people were going to be able to connect with each other, and that this was going to then motivate people to go out and vote. And it turns out that the numbers don't really change all that much, and when they do change, the media are not the causal factors. Media certainly had something to do with the increased voter turnout in 2024 compared to 2020 and 2016, but it was part and parcel, I think, of a political culture in which people were, I think, more broadly engaged with political questions, some of which they learned about on television. So it's a great question, and it remains an open one. And I think it's something that the political scientists and historians and communication scholars are often debating. Is like, does the mass media help or harm American political culture? Like that is, the utopian view is always that it's going to engage people more, and then the dystopian view is always like, no, it just misinforms people or it makes them feel disengaged, or everybody just does everything from their couch and they don't bother getting up to vote. Great question, though.
Dr. Stamm, for that, and that's super interesting to think about as well. The disillusionment and disengagement people can have from too much media, almost.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a real thing. I mean, that sense of it being everywhere all the time, and you can't turn it off because then your friends are going to think you're dead. Like you turn your phone off for 2 hours when you're not on an airplane flight that your friends know about. They're like, "Where are you? Like, what's going on?" And you get off. We always have this when we land after a long airplane flight, and you turn your phone back on, and you got 10 messages from people who are freaking out because you haven't responded to them in 10 minutes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I know I'm aware of time for you, Dr. Stamm, for everyone here.
I'll take these last three if people want to ask. They raised their hands, so yeah. You guys you're asking great questions. It's really fun to talk to you all. But I'll take these three before we go.
Definitely. Those last three I see,
Yeah.
from AP first, and then maybe Anon and Monica, if that works to close off.
Hey, Professor Stan, thank you
Yeah.
so much. Really, really interesting subject
Thank you.
here. And I want to be mindful of our time as well. But I guess I just wanted to ask how you conceive of sort of cultural memory of the
Mhm.
Telegram. Cultural and intellectual history are I'm a history major, and so
Uh-huh.
geek out over sort of intellectual history, but
Yeah.
it seems like cultural memory of the telegraph as the first technology to sort of collapse time and space in communication continues to shape how we perceive today's
Mhm.
technological revolutions, whether AI, 5G, uh, quantum communication, etc. And so the
Mhm.
telegraph, per sort of, your talk today, it seems to have introduced a world where communication is monitored, it's intercepted, it's manipulated, concerns that have
Mhm.
only intensified in
Yeah.
today's landscape. So I guess I'm wondering, why is it important to understand the telegraph in discussions
Mhm.
today, whether it's about the tech rivalry, whether it's about the resurgence in certain telegraph-like systems and secure isolated communication networks?
Yep.
And how do you think sort of cultural memory of the telegraph influences the way we view technological driven
Mhm.
revolutions today, especially, in AI? Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. So I think the telegraph is important. Understanding the telegraph is important because I think it makes you understand the 19th century better, and it helps you understand the 21st century better. It helps you understand the 19th century better because you understand people as being more modern than you might think if you didn't understand the role of telegraphy in their life. So it's easy to think of these when you think about cultural and intellectual history. This is an era. This is the Lincoln Douglas debates. Like you hear about these like this is Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is Henry David Thoreau. But when you start understanding the role of the telegraph, well, that's some of the reasons why Thoreau went to the woods. The 19th century was louder, it was more chaotic, it was more immediate. These are people that we have these old daguerreotype type photographs, and people look really funny because they had to sit really still because it was a long exposure image, and they look like they're constipated. And so they look like people from another universe. And I think understanding the telegraph helps you realize that their lives, there's a lot of things that were different about the world that they lived in, politically, socially, all of that. But their intellectual lives were significantly more modern than I think people think they are once you understand the culture this culture of kind of immediacy that they lived in. I think it helps you understand. I think it helps people understand sectionalism a little bit better. The North and South were not nearly as divided as one can think if you just take the idea that the Civil War happened. Telegraph wires connecting these things. If you were in New York City, you were reading news about Atlanta every single day. So the 19th century seems more contemporary and more appropriately. I'm not reading anything back on it. I think you can understand it as appropriately modern if you understand the way that the telegraph was an ordinary part, a regular part of people's lives. Now, to the other part of your question, like I think one of the other things that is really important about understanding the telegraph in the 21st century and having a sense of the cultural memory of the telegraph is it helps you understand what's really new about the contemporary moment. That one of the biggest fallacies you can commit as a historian is to assume that because something's new to you, it's new to history. And there's a lot of statements that people have made in recent years about the novelty of the internet. Um, the novelty of AI that are just grossly inaccurate when you think about them in historical terms. On the other hand, and this is why I ended with there's a tremendous amount of stuff that's different about the world in a world of the iPhone, in a world of generative AI. But I think knowing this history, if you're somebody who knowing this history makes you a better historian, but it also, if you're a history minded person who wants to be engaged in these industries or in thinking about these things, being involved in politics, it really does help you understand the nature of the novelty. And it helps you not overstate the revolutionary impact of everything. And what it allows you to do then is to hone in on the stuff that is genuinely new and genuinely transformative. That's why, with the iPhone, I think what's genuinely new and what was genuinely new and transformative about that was the loss of privacy. I think people they talk about instantaneous communication or convergence media. Well, it's important, but that's part of an evolutionary, not revolutionary process. But the tracking of everything is revolutionary. So I think if you understand that, if you have a sense of the history of that, it allows you to be a better person in the present, making sense of what's actually new about what's going on around you. Thank you for the question. Great one.
All right. Super interesting. And I think Inan, I believe, had a question, and then we'll go to Monica after. That sounds okay. I
It's
believe,
like it looks like Anon might have froze.
yes, I believe the perils of Zoom has struck again. But Inan, if you reconnect later, we will go back to you. I think we can go to Monica
See, all
for
these technologies that are supposed to be all revolutionary, making your life better, this is what you get. You get Zoom freezes.
yeah.
It's like, yep, there you go.
So yeah, Monica, I think perfect.
Hi,
Hi, nice to meet you, Monica.
nice to meet you. This might be a little bit off topic, but I was curious, your latest book, Dead Tree Media, it discusses and sort of draws attention to the relationship between the US and Canada in regards to the economic implications of the production of newspapers in the US as US newspapers relied on Canadian timber. And I was curious how this relationship has evolved in recent years, specifically with the rapid shift to online news media as well as like the current political climate and tension.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for it. Yeah, thanks. Great question. So it's the shift to online media. It has been devastating to some communities in Canada because the in the middle of the 20th century, 80% of the paper that newspapers used to print came from Canada. Like it was a Canadian tree got cut down, made into a reel of newsprint, stuck on a train or a boat, and then brought to the United States. And that was the actual paper that you read in the United States, where you read the news. But what this meant was that there was a lot of these towns across, especially the northern parts of Ontario and Quebec, where the main thing that was in that town was the paper mill. And you find the Kapuskasing, Ontario, Baie-Comeau, Quebec. You find these all across because there's not much up there. It's trees and rocks, as they say. So what has happened is as American newspaper circulation has declined, um, there's less paper needed. Less paper needed means fewer jobs in paper mills, and so there's a lot of these towns that have become ghost towns in the way that Flint, Michigan became one, following the decline of automobile production. Like this was the one industry in the town. Um, so it was, it was kind of a fascinating part of the relationship between the two countries for much of the 20th century is that, Canada had the trees because a lot of this was spruce and pine, which is a kind of northern tree, and we don't have given the fact that its latitude is higher, it has those trees, and you follow this line around the globe, and that's why Norway and northern Germany and Finland have a lot of paper making as well. But we were dependent on them for that, and a huge amount of the Canadian economy was dependent on us, and this is why. I mean, it's not all about newsprint right now, but it's one of the reasons why Canadians have been so anxious about all of these debates about tariff that have been happening recently, is because they realize that for well over a century now, the two countries have been really tightly linked by trade. I mean, the cliche about the border is that it's the longest unpoliced border in the world. And I think that's changed now because I do think that it is policed in parts of it that there didn't used to be. But I mean, I remember as a kid being up in Montana and you could just before 9/11, you could go across the border without a passport. So I had friends my age who grew up in Metro Detroit when the drinking age was 19. I had friends who grew up in Ypsilanti, and they would the minute one of their friends turned 19, that kid was making beer runs to Windsor because you could just cross the border and you didn't need a passport, and you could just go over and buy a bunch of beer and stick it in your trunk and drive back and Friday night in Ypsilanti. Um, the border hardened a lot after 9/11. It's now you now need a passport to get across there. And so I mean I talk to students all the time in my classes who grew up in Metro Detroit and have never visited Canada. So they've grown up with essentially a long bike ride of a foreign country that they've never visited. So the relationship was defined by trade in newspapers, starting in the 1960s in automobiles, and it's one of the reasons why Canadians today are so anxious about what's going on is because they know how dependent they are on trade with the United States, and they believe that they have been good partners in that relationship, and I think they're right. And they're facing an American government that is disrupting the way that relationship has worked, and so. The newsprint was the most important thing traded between the two countries from about 1910 to about 1960. The building of automobile factories across the river from Detroit starting in the 1950s changed that, and autos became more important. But for about 50 years before that, it was just big giant they look like big toilet paper rolls. That was the most important thing moving across the border. And I'll say, one way that this history continues down to the present day that I think is really interesting and important to recognize is that the things that the media content that we consume as Americans or in America has an influence on the environment of foreign countries. So in the 20th century, American newspapers were there because Canadian trees got cut down. Well, you can find if you the stuff that goes into these things doesn't come from the United States. The lithium comes from Chile. The rare earth metals come from Africa. The aluminum comes. This you don't. The aluminum doesn't. They don't do aluminum mining for the most part. They do smelting in the in many cases in the United States, but not the mining. So these just like the Canadian trees created the newspapers, a lot of these foreign materials create these media devices that are manufactured in China in most cases that we consume in the United States. So it's really it's and the last thing the other thing about this is all of the like these servers exist. If you've heard about these like server farms or Bitcoin mining, like it internet usage is incredibly data intensive. Like it the power that these things are in our hands and we plug them in and we charge them. But the place where the media is that we're streaming, that's a data center. And those are tremendous energy hogs. And they're running on natural gas or hydroelectricity, or in some cases, coal. And so there's an environmental footprint left by media in the present day that's very similar, that's not dissimilar from trees being cut down 100 years ago, 80 years ago to be brought to be made into newspapers.
Can I just ask something really quick? Was
Sure.
that a HAL 9000 lock screen?
That
'Cause I love
is.
that.
Yeah,
It's my
good.
favorite movie.
That's my I don't know. My favorite movie of all time, I think. Nice, good catch.
Awesome. And I think we have time for our final
Yep.
question of the night from Inan to close off.
Yeah, sorry, my internet
It's
just
okay.
went out. But in your book, Dead Tree Media, you address the environmental Canadian origin of printed media in the US. So, what was the significance in recognizing newspapers and literature as not just a source of information, but also an industrial product? And how do you think today's political climate will affect your work with environmental awareness, especially after global climate change agreements have been withdrawn in the United States?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I just talked about this a little bit in regard to Monica's question. I think it's a tremendously important issue that I think a lot about as a citizen, because I think people have the sense that that 20th, 21st century information you often hear the term dematerialized. Like it's all bits and bytes flying through the ether. That's not the case at all. In the 20th century, the newspaper was a material object that was made out of natural that you would cut down trees to make a newspaper. Smartphones are the same thing. They're compendiums of minerals, metals, rare earth metals, and they leave a footprint. And then in some cases, that footprint is significant. It's really striking if you go and look. You can find this pretty readily through Google. I think Greenpeace used to do these. I think the United Nations used to, but the problem of what's known as e-waste is a huge problem around the world. Like what do you do with a flat screen TV once you're done with it? What do you do with your monitor? What do you do with it? Like there's millions of tons a year of things that are just there's a scene in the movie Solo where they're sort of tracking down. I remember like there were the people kind of picking through this electronic detritus, and this is a real thing that you find in certain parts of what's known as in certain parts of Africa, for example, that they just drop off ton after ton of electronic waste, and people will sort of pick these things apart to find the lithium, the battery that they can reuse, or these little bits of metal that can be smelted down. And the transmission of this information through the data centers is tremendously energy intensive. I don't know the exact statistic these days. The last time I looked this up, the statistic that I remember was that if the internet were a country, it would have the environmental footprint of Germany, which is not insignificant. I mean, I think Germany is the seventh largest economy in the world. And so we think about it. Our interaction with it is often through these light little devices that we carry around, or a MacBook Air. Or our computers are getting lighter and lighter by the year. But when you add these up, by the millions or the billions, it's incredibly impactful on the planet. The manufacture of these things, the use of these things, And I've started for myself thinking about it through the same lens, thinking about some of my media choices in the way that I think about my food choices. I don't think it's as important. I mean, I think, after fossil fuels, meat consumption, I think is one of the most important impacts on the planet. So, and I'm not going to argue that like smartphone usage, I don't think statistically that's true, but it's not neutral. It's not nothing. And so I think the choices that we make about the kinds of media that we consume and how engaged with they are, I think it's important to understand that these things do leave a footprint, that they are important environment. Again, want to be clear about this. It's not as important like it buying an electric car versus a car that runs on gas. That's going to be you're going to do better for the environment doing that than you are by curtailing your smartphone usage. But I do think it's important to remember that these things do have a material presence in the world, that there are other human beings who made these things and who made these things often for very low wages. And they made these things from materials that were gathered from countries that are not democratic and where people have really substandard living practices and who suffer from the so-called resource curse because foreign corporations are going in there to mine them for the minerals that they need to make all of this stuff that make our lives in an advanced industrial economy more convenient. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's something I try to be mindful of myself in all aspects of my life. Is just how deep of a footprint am I leaving, and are there things that I can do to be more mindful of as a consumer and as a citizen? And one of those things I think is actually disengaging from the media a little bit. Like not going to we're not going to change the world by doing that. But if you do a little bit of Googling around at the amount of energy that the internet uses, it's sobering to see the carbon emissions caused by a Netflix binge, for example. Like we're very conscious of these things in like hamburgers and cars, and like even like some clothing manufacturers now are even including information on the tag about the environmental footprint of the garment. And it's important to understand that the things that we consume in the media are part of that as well.
Great.
Yeah.
I think save any last minute final questions that anyone might have. Uh, this was incredible. So thank you,
Yeah.
Dr. Stan,
Yeah,
for
thank you all this. The questions were terrific. I really enjoyed talking to you all. I hope it was interesting. I'm if any of you ever need anything or have any questions that I can help with, I'm very easy to. This is my email address is simply my last name at msu.edu. Just anything I can do to help any of you, just ask. Just shoot me an email, tell me that you were on the call, and I'll tell me what you need, and I'll be glad to help you. It's really you're a really great group, and it was really fun to. I appreciate the invitation, and it was really great to hear these terrific questions and to have this conversation with you also. So thank you for a fun way to end the day.
thank you, Dr. Stam.
Right.
Yes, thank you once again. We
Yeah,
are uh our horizons are definitely expanded today. Much was taken away. So thank you once
right
again
on. Cool. Thank
for
you again. I hope you all have a nice evening. Take care of yourselves.
yes, thank you. And a thank you
Bye
to
bye.
everyone who came today, and we'll see you soon. We'll see you. Keep tuning in. Thank you, everyone.